June 6, 1944. 156,000 Allied soldiers are about to storm the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. But what if I told you that Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower knew something absolutely devastating about D-Day, that he deliberately kept hidden from almost every single soldier who would land on those beaches that morning? I'm talking about intelligence so dark, so terrifying, that if the troops had known the full truth, the invasion might never have happened. This isn't some conspiracy theory. This is documented fact that's been sitting in declassified files, and what you're about to discover will completely change everything you thought you knew about D-Day. We're diving into the secrets, the lies, and the calculated decisions that sent thousands of men into hell, and by the end of this video, you're going to see June 6, 1944 in a completely different light. And listen, if you're already hooked by this, do me a favor right now and smash that subscribe button for WW2 Echoes, because we're about to go deep into World War II history that nobody talks about, the kind of stories that get buried in classified documents and only surface decades later when the people involved are long gone. Hit that like button too, because this video took weeks of research through military archives, declassified intelligence reports, and first-hand accounts that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you want to be subscribed for what's coming on this channel. So let's set the scene. It's early 1944. The Allies have been planning the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe for over a year. Stalin is screaming at Churchill and Roosevelt to open a second front in the West to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. The Germans know an invasion is coming. They just don't know where or when. Eisenhower is appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, which means every decision, every death, every success, and every failure lands on his shoulders. And the pressure is absolutely crushing. This isn't just another military operation. This is the moment that will decide whether the Nazis can be defeated or whether Hitler's fortress Europe will hold. Get this wrong, and World War II could drag on for years. Hundreds of thousands more will die. The Soviet Union might make a separate peace with Germany. The entire future of Western civilization hangs in the balance. No pressure, right? But here's what most people don't know. Eisenhower had intelligence reports sitting on his desk that painted an absolutely horrifying picture of what would happen when those landing craft hit the beaches. Allied intelligence knew the Germans had heavily fortified the entire Atlantic coast. They knew about the underwater obstacles, the mines, the machine gun nests, the artillery positions perfectly positioned to turn the beaches into killing zones. But there was something else, something that even senior commanders didn't fully understand until it was too late. The intelligence estimates predicted that casualties on the first day could reach 30 to 50% in some units. Let me say that again. 30 to 50% casualties. That means if you're in a company of 200 men, between 60 and 100 of your buddies aren't coming home. Those are Civil War battle numbers. Those are Somme and Verdun numbers. And Eisenhower knew it. Now here's where it gets really dark. Eisenhower wrote 2 speeches on June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day. Everyone knows about the first one, the inspiring order of the day that told the troops they were about to embark on a great crusade. But the second speech, that one was locked away. It was the speech he would give if D-Day failed. And in that speech, he accepted full responsibility for the disaster. He'd already written the words admitting defeat before a single soldier hit the beach. Think about that. The Supreme Commander was so convinced that D-Day could go catastrophically wrong that he pre-wrote his own resignation speech. But he couldn't tell anyone. He had to project absolute confidence while internally preparing for the worst military disaster in American history. The intelligence that Eisenhower had access to was incredibly detailed and absolutely terrifying. Allied spies, French resistance fighters, and reconnaissance flights had built up a comprehensive picture of German defenses. They knew about Rommel's Atlantic Wall. They knew about the steel obstacles and wooden stakes on the beaches designed to rip apart landing craft. They knew about the minefields that would shred infantry. But here's what makes this even worse. They also knew that their pre-invasion bombing campaign hadn't worked nearly as well as they hoped. Weather had disrupted bombing runs, cloud cover prevented accurate targeting. Many German positions survived intact. Eisenhower knew this. His intelligence officers knew this. But to soldiers loading into those landing craft at midnight on June 5th, They had no idea what they were sailing into. There's a specific moment that illustrates this perfectly. Eisenhower visited the 101st Airborne Division on the evening of June 5th, just hours before they would parachute into France ahead of the beach landings. Photographers captured him talking to the paratroopers, smiling, joking, projecting confidence. But his aide later wrote that on the drive back to headquarters, Eisenhower was silent for 20 minutes. Then he said something chilling. He told his aide that he had just looked into the eyes of men who would be dead in 24 hours, and they had no idea. He knew the casualty estimates for the airborne drops. Scattered drops, landing in the wrong zones, German troops waiting, paratroopers hung up in trees and slaughtered before they could even cut themselves free. The estimates said the airborne divisions could lose 70% of their men. 70%. And Eisenhower shook their hands, smiled, and sent them to their deaths without telling them the odds. But wait, here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Eisenhower didn't just hide the casualty estimates from the regular soldiers. He also manipulated the information going to the press and the American public. The military carefully controlled what journalists could report from the invasion. The first waves hitting Omaha Beach faced absolutely hellish resistance. Men were being cut down before they even got off the landing craft. Bodies were piling up in the surf. Entire units were being wiped out in minutes. But back in the United States, the initial reports talked about light resistance and the invasion going according to plan. It took days before the American public learned the truth about what happened at Omaha Beach. By then, the beachhead was secured, so the casualties could be framed as a necessary price for victory rather than the near disaster it actually was. And here's something that's going to make you angry. Eisenhower and the Allied High Command knew that one beach in particular was going to be a bloodbath. Omaha Beach. The intelligence was clear. Omaha had the worst terrain, the strongest defenses, and the Germans had recently moved an entire additional division into the area. That division, the 352nd Infantry Division, was a full-strength combat-experienced unit that nobody expected to be there. Allied intelligence somehow missed this movement, or if they caught it, the information didn't get to the assault troops in time. So the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions hit Omaha Beach expecting light resistance from a weak coastal defense unit. Instead, they ran into battle-hardened veterans with excellent positions and interlocking fields of fire. It was a slaughter. For 6 hours, the outcome at Omaha Beach was in doubt. Commanders on the naval ships offshore were seriously considering abandoning the beach entirely and diverting follow-up waves to Utah or the British beaches. If Omaha had failed, the entire invasion could have failed. The Allied line would have had a massive gap. The Germans could have concentrated forces to roll up the other beaches. D-Day could have become the disaster Eisenhower's backup speech prepared for. Let me tell you about a guy named Bedford, Virginia. Tiny town. Population about 3,000 people. The town sent 35 men to Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment. Company A was in the first wave at Omaha Beach. Within 15 minutes of hitting the beach, 19 of those 35 men from Bedford were dead. By the end of the day, 23 were gone. One small town lost nearly an entire generation of young men in a single morning. And here's the thing that should haunt everyone. Those men went into battle believing they had air support, naval bombardment, and overwhelming force on their side. They believed the pre-invasion bombing had destroyed German defenses. They believed it was going to be tough, but manageable. Nobody told them the bombing had missed most of the targets. Nobody told them they were about to face a full-strength veteran division. They learned the truth when the ramp dropped and machine gun fire started cutting through their ranks like a scythe through wheat. But here's where it gets interesting. Was Eisenhower wrong to hide this information? This is the moral question that's haunted military historians for 80 years. If you tell 156,000 soldiers that 30 to 50% of them are going to die, what happens? Do they refuse to board the landing craft? Does morale collapse? Do you get mass desertions? Or do they go anyway? But now they're terrified, hesitant, and more likely to freeze up under fire, which actually increases casualties. Eisenhower made a calculated decision that ignorance was better than knowledge. He decided that sending men into battle believing they would probably survive was more effective than sending them in knowing they would probably die. And you know what? He might have been right. The soldiers who hit those beaches fought with incredible courage, precisely because they believed they could win. If they had known the true odds, would they have fought as hard? Would they have pushed forward through the obstacles and the gunfire? Or would they have gone to ground and gotten pinned down, turning D-Day into a catastrophic failure? There's another secret that Eisenhower kept hidden, and this one is even more controversial. The Allies had practice runs for D-Day, training exercises where they simulated the beach landings. One of these exercises, called Exercise Tiger, happened in late April 1944 at Slapton Sands in England. The beach there resembled the Normandy beaches, so it was perfect for training. Thousands of American troops participated. And it went horribly, catastrophically wrong. German E-boats, fast attack craft, stumbled onto the exercise and attacked the convoy of landing ships. They torpedoed multiple vessels. Over 700 American soldiers and sailors died. 700 dead in a training exercise, and the American public never found out about it. The military locked it down with the tightest security imaginable. Why? Because imagine the outcry if Americans learned that hundreds of their boys died in a practice invasion, and now Eisenhower wanted to send thousands more into the real thing. The families of Exercise Tiger victims were told their loved ones died in training accidents, which was technically true, but they never learned the full story until decades later. Eisenhower and his staff made the decision that this information was too damaging to morale and public support for the invasion, so they buried it. And it gets worse. Some of the bodies from Exercise Tiger washed up on English beaches, still wearing their gear and uniforms. British authorities quietly collected them and buried them in secret. The whole thing was covered up so thoroughly that many veterans of D-Day didn't know Exercise Tiger had even happened until historians uncovered the story in the 1980s. That's 40 years of silence about an event that killed more Americans than some entire battles in the Pacific. But Eisenhower decided the invasion was too important to risk any information that might undermine public support, so he authorized the cover-up, and 700 American families never learned the full truth about how their sons and husbands and fathers died. Now let's talk about the airborne drops, because this is where Eisenhower's hidden knowledge gets truly brutal. The plan called for 3 airborne divisions, 2 American and 1 British, to drop inland behind the beaches before dawn on D-Day. Their job was to secure key bridges, roads, and towns to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. But the airborne commanders knew this plan was incredibly risky. The pilots would be flying through darkness, through anti-aircraft fire, through bad weather. The chances of dropping the paratroopers in the right locations were slim. Intelligence estimates said the airborne divisions would be scattered across miles of French countryside. Isolated groups would be cut off and surrounded. The casualty rates would be horrific. When British Air Marshal Lee Mallory saw the plan, he wrote a memo to Eisenhower predicting that the airborne operation would result in 70% casualties and accomplish almost nothing. 70%. That means 7 out of every 10 paratroopers would be dead, wounded, or captured. Eisenhower read that memo. He considered canceling the airborne drops entirely. But in the end, he decided the operation was too important. The airborne troops had to secure those inland positions or the beach landings could fail. So he sent them anyway. Thousands of young men, barely out of their teens, loaded into C-47 transport planes, knowing they were jumping into occupied France, but not knowing that their own commanders expected 70% of them to become casualties. And you know what happened? Lee Mallory was almost right. The drops were a disaster. Paratroopers were scattered over hundreds of square miles. Units were completely mixed up. Men landed in swamps and drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others landed directly on German positions and were killed immediately. Small groups of Americans and British paratroopers spent D-Day wandering the French countryside trying to find their units. Complete chaos. But here's the amazing thing. Despite the chaos, despite the casualties, despite everything going wrong, the airborne troops accomplished their mission. They created so much confusion behind German lines that the enemy couldn't mount an effective response to the beach landings. Scattered groups of paratroopers attacked roads, cut communications, and generally made the Germans think there were Allied troops everywhere. The very chaos that made the drop such a nightmare actually worked in the Allies' favor. But the paratroopers paid a terrible price. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions suffered over 2,500 casualties on D-Day. That's 2,500 young Americans dead, wounded, or missing, and almost none of them knew before they jumped that their own commanders expected most of them to die. Let me share something that really drives this home. There's a famous photograph of Eisenhower talking to paratroopers of the 522nd Parachute Infantry Regiment on the evening of June 5th. He's smiling, the soldiers are smiling, everyone looks confident. One of the soldiers in that photograph was a private named Wallace Strobel. Years later, Strobel was interviewed about that moment, and he said something chilling. He remembered Eisenhower asking where they were from, making small talk, being friendly and approachable. But Strobel also remembered thinking that Eisenhower looked sad. His eyes looked sad even though he was smiling. Strobel didn't understand it at the time, but decades later he realized that Eisenhower was looking at him and the other paratroopers, knowing that many of them would be dead within hours. That's the burden of command that nobody talks about. Eisenhower had to send men to their deaths while pretending everything would be fine. He had to project confidence he didn't feel and hide knowledge that would terrify the troops. And he carried that burden alone because he couldn't share it with anyone without risking the entire operation. Now here's something that nobody talks about: the weather decision. D-Day was originally scheduled for June 5th, but the weather was terrible. Storms, high winds, rough seas. Eisenhower's meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, predicted a brief window of slightly better weather on June 6th. Just a window, mind you, still not ideal, but maybe good enough. Eisenhower had to decide: postpone the invasion and wait for better weather, which might not come for weeks and would mean the Germans might discover the plan, or go on June 6th in marginal conditions and hope for the best. He chose to go. But here's the secret. The weather on June 6th was still bad, really bad. Seasick soldiers, rough seas that swamped landing craft, cloud cover that disrupted air support. The conditions were far worse than ideal, and Eisenhower knew it. He sent the invasion forward anyway because the alternatives were worse. But the soldiers loading into those pitching, rolling landing craft, vomiting from seasickness, had no idea that their supreme commander had just rolled the dice on weather conditions that his own experts said were barely acceptable. If the weather had been just slightly worse, thousands more would have died in the surf before even reaching the beaches. And here's the part that's going to blow your mind. The Germans actually believed the weather was too bad for an invasion. Rommel, the commander of German forces in France, was so confident the Allies wouldn't invade in early June weather that he left Normandy on June 4th to visit his wife in Germany for her birthday. He wasn't even in France on D-Day. Other German commanders held a planning conference in Rennes, far from Normandy, on the night of June 5th. They were all away from their posts because they believed the weather made an invasion impossible. Eisenhower's gamble on bad weather actually helped achieve surprise. The Germans were caught completely off guard because they made the same assessment Eisenhower's advisors made. The weather was too risky. But Eisenhower understood something crucial. The Allies had overwhelming force. Even in bad weather, even with higher casualties from rough seas and disrupted air support, the sheer weight of numbers would eventually prevail. The Germans didn't have that luxury. So Eisenhower accepted the additional casualties that bad weather would cause because he knew the strategic surprise was more valuable. But again, the soldiers didn't know this. They just knew they were scared, seasick, and heading toward the sounds of distant gunfire. Let's talk about the deception operations, because this is another area where Eisenhower deliberately manipulated information to serve the larger mission. Operation Fortitude was a massive deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The Allies created an entire fake army in southeast England, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and even put General Patton in command of this phantom force because the Germans believed Patton was America's best general. The deception worked brilliantly. Even after D-Day, Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was a diversion and the real invasion was still coming at Calais. He held back entire panzer divisions that could have crushed the Normandy beachhead. But here's the thing. Thousands of Allied soldiers were kept in England as part of this deception, ready to make a fake invasion of Calais that would never happen. These men trained for an operation they would never execute, while their buddies were dying in Normandy. Some of them didn't land in France until weeks after D-Day. They sat in England, listening to news reports about the invasion, knowing their friends were fighting and dying, and they couldn't do anything because their job was to be part of a fake army. Eisenhower never told them their role was pure deception. They believed they were training for a real operation, and they had to maintain that belief, so their letters home and any captured prisoners would reinforce the deception. That's another level of manipulation that most people never consider. Using your own soldiers as unwitting pawns in a strategic deception, keeping them away from the real fight to maintain a fake threat. Now I want to tell you about the most controversial decision Eisenhower made regarding D-Day intelligence, and this one is absolutely brutal. Allied intelligence knew that the French resistance would rise up and attack German positions once the invasion began. These were brave French men and women who had been secretly organizing and preparing for years. But Allied commanders also knew that the Germans would retaliate with horrific brutality. They knew that French civilians would be massacred in reprisal, and they accepted it. In fact, they planned for it. The French resistance attacks would tie down German troops, disrupt communications, and slow reinforcements heading to Normandy. The cost would be thousands of French civilians executed by the Nazis. But Eisenhower and the Allied command decided the strategic benefit was worth the cost. They never told the French resistance leaders that the Allies expected massive civilian casualties as a result of the uprising. In towns across France, particularly in the south, German SS units massacred entire villages in response to resistance attacks. Ordor-sur-Glane, a village of about 650 people, was completely destroyed on June 10th, just 4 days after D-Day. The SS herded all the women and children into the church and set it on fire. They machine-gunned the men. Only 6 people survived. The Germans were sending a message to the French resistance, and the Allies knew this would happen. But they activated the resistance anyway, because the strategic value outweighed the human cost. Let me pause here and ask you something. Drop a comment below and tell me, was Eisenhower right to hide all this information? If you were Supreme Commander, would you tell soldiers the truth about the odds they faced? Or would you do what Eisenhower did and calculate that necessary lies would save the mission, even if they couldn't save individual lives? This is the moral complexity of war that nobody teaches in history class. There are no clean answers. Every choice leads to deaths. The only question is which choice leads to fewer deaths and accomplishes the strategic objective. Eisenhower decided that hiding the worst intelligence, manipulating information, and accepting horrific casualties in some units was justified if it led to overall success. And you know what? D-Day did succeed. Hitler's Atlantic Wall was breached. The liberation of Western Europe began. Nazi Germany was put on the path to defeat. But it cost nearly 10,000 Allied casualties on June 6th alone, with over 4,000 dead. Those are the men who paid the price for Eisenhower's decisions. Here's another dark truth that's been buried in classified files for decades. The Allies had intelligence that some German units in Normandy included former Soviet prisoners of war who had been forced into German service. These were Russians, Ukrainians, and other Eastern Europeans who had been captured on the Eastern Front and given a choice: starve in a POW camp or put on a German uniform and garrison the Atlantic Wall. Thousands took the uniform. Allied intelligence knew these units had low morale and would likely surrender quickly. But they also knew the hardcore SS and Wehrmacht units would fight fanatically. The problem was, you couldn't tell which was which from the landing craft. So, soldiers hitting the beaches had no idea if they were facing reluctant conscripts who would throw down their weapons or SS fanatics who would fight to the last bullet. This uncertainty added another layer of terror to the landing. You're running across open sand, bullets are flying, explosions everywhere, and you have no idea if the Germans shooting at you are going to surrender if you get close or fight to the death. Some units got lucky and hit beaches defended by these reluctant Eastern European troops, who surrendered quickly. Other units hit SS positions and faced fanatical resistance. It was pure luck which type of enemy you encountered, and Eisenhower knew this, but couldn't tell the assault troops because the intelligence came from code breaking that had to remain secret. Let's talk about the naval bombardment, because this is another area where what the soldiers believed and what the commanders knew were very different. The plan called for massive naval bombardment before the landings. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers would pound the German positions for hours before the first landing craft hit the beach. The soldiers were told this bombardment would destroy most of the German defenses and make their job much easier. But the naval commanders knew something different. The bombardment would be impressive and loud, but it probably wouldn't destroy the German bunkers. Those positions were hardened concrete bunkers designed to withstand heavy shelling. Unless you got a direct hit through a gun port, the bunkers would survive. And accuracy from a ship rolling in rough seas, firing at targets miles inland, was not great. The naval bombardment at Omaha Beach, which needed it most, lasted only 40 minutes, and most shells landed inland, missing the beach defenses entirely. The soldiers found this out when the ramps dropped and the supposedly destroyed German bunkers opened up with machine guns and artillery. At Utah Beach, the naval bombardment was more effective, partly because the current pushed the landing craft a mile south of the intended beach, and they ended up hitting a less heavily defended sector by accident. Pure dumb luck saved thousands of lives at Utah. But nobody knew it at the time. The soldiers just knew that the naval bombardment didn't do what they were told it would do, and now they were paying the price. Here's something that should make you really angry. The Army Air Force promised that heavy bombers would crater the beaches and destroy German positions before the landings. They sent hundreds of B-17 and B-24 bombers to hit the beaches at dawn, but the bomber crews were terrified of hitting the landing craft approaching the shore, so they delayed their bomb releases. Instead of cratering the beaches, most of the bombs landed miles inland in empty fields. The bombardment accomplished almost nothing. At Omaha Beach, not a single German position was destroyed by the air bombardment. The soldiers were told they would find cratered defenses and scattered defenders. Instead, they found intact bunkers and fully alert Germans. This wasn't malice. It was fog of war and excessive caution by bomber crews. But the result was the same. The soldiers had been given false expectations about what they would face, and it cost lives. Eisenhower knew the air bombardment plan was risky, that weather and accuracy problems could make it ineffective, but he couldn't postpone the invasion for better bombing weather. So he sent the soldiers in hoping the bombardment had worked, knowing it might not have, and unable to warn them of the possibility because it would undermine morale. Now let's get into something that's really going to change how you see D-Day. The Rangers at Point de Hoc. You probably heard the story. 225 Army Rangers scaled a 100-foot cliff under fire to capture a German artillery battery that could have devastated Omaha and Utah beaches. It's one of the most heroic actions of D-Day. But here's what you weren't told. Allied intelligence reported that there were 6 large artillery guns at Point de Hoc. That intelligence was wrong. When the Rangers fought their way to the top of the cliff after taking massive casualties, they found the guns had been moved inland. The positions were empty. The Rangers had scaled that cliff, taken severe casualties, and captured an empty position. They later found the guns hidden in an orchard and destroyed them, but the entire premise of their mission was based on faulty intelligence. And Eisenhower knew, or should have known, that the intelligence on German gun positions was incomplete. Reconnaissance photographs showed the guns weren't in their positions days before the invasion, but that information apparently didn't reach the Rangers in time. So they went ahead with a mission based on outdated intelligence, and it cost them. Out of 225 Rangers who started the mission, only 90 were still fit for combat by the end of D-Day. Over 60% casualties to capture empty gun positions. That's the cost of intelligence failures and the fog of war. And here's where I need you to really understand the weight of what Eisenhower was carrying. Every single one of these decisions, every piece of hidden intelligence, every manipulation of information, every accepted risk, they all came back to him. If D-Day had failed, Eisenhower would have been remembered as the general who led the greatest military disaster in history. His career would have been destroyed. He might have faced court-martial. His name would be synonymous with failure. But if he had shared all the dark intelligence with the troops, if he had told them the true odds, if he had been completely honest about the risks and the expected casualties, D-Day might have failed anyway, because morale would have collapsed. So he made the hardest choice a commander can make. He accepted the moral burden of lying to his own men, of sending them into hell with false assurances, because he believed that was the only way the mission could succeed. And he was probably right. D-Day succeeded not because the plans were perfect, or the intelligence was accurate, or the bombardments were effective, but because 156,000 Allied soldiers had the courage to storm those beaches, believing they could win. If Eisenhower had taken away that belief by telling them the full truth, they might not have had the courage to get off those landing craft. There's a letter that Eisenhower wrote to his wife Mamie a few days after D-Day. In it, he said that June 6th was the longest day of his life. He spent the entire day at headquarters receiving fragmentary reports from the beaches. For hours, he didn't know if the invasion was succeeding or failing. The reports from Omaha Beach were particularly dire. At one point, commanders were seriously discussing evacuating Omaha and diverting all reinforcements to the other beaches. If Omaha had been lost, the entire invasion plan would have unraveled. Eisenhower sat in his office, unable to do anything to help the men fighting and dying on the beaches, knowing that every casualty was a result of decisions he had made. That's a level of responsibility that most of us can't even imagine. And when the reports finally came in that all 5 beaches were secured, that the Atlantic Wall had been breached, that the invasion was succeeding despite massive casualties, Eisenhower didn't celebrate. He just felt relief that it hadn't been worse. He knew the butcher's bill would be horrific, and he knew he would carry the weight of those deaths for the rest of his life. So what's the final truth about D-Day that Eisenhower hid from those 156,000 soldiers? It's this. He knew that thousands of them would die. He knew the casualties would be far worse than anyone publicly admitted. He knew the plans had flaws that couldn't be fixed. He knew the intelligence was incomplete and sometimes wrong. He knew the bombardments probably wouldn't work as advertised. And he knew all of this, but he sent them anyway because the alternative was worse. The alternative was leaving Hitler in control of Europe, letting the Holocaust continue, letting Stalin potentially cut a deal with Germany, and abandoning any hope of defeating the Nazis. Eisenhower made a calculation that the lives of the soldiers who would die on D-Day were an acceptable price to pay for ending Nazi tyranny and liberating Europe. And you know what? History proved him right. D-Day was the beginning of the end for Hitler. Within a year, the war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany was defeated. The concentration camps were liberated. Millions of lives were saved because of what happened on June 6, 1944. But we should never forget that the victory came at a terrible cost. And that cost was borne by young men who went into battle not knowing the full truth about what they faced. And that brings us to today. Why does this matter 80 years later? Because the lessons of D-Day aren't just about history. They're about leadership, sacrifice, and the terrible moral calculations that come with command. Every military operation involves sending people into danger based on incomplete information and calculated risk. The question is always the same. How much truth do you tell the people you're sending into harm's way? Do you protect them from knowledge that might break their spirit? Or do you give them the full picture and trust them to make their own choices? Eisenhower chose the first option, and it worked. But we should be honest about what that means. It means that soldiers died believing they would probably survive when their commanders knew better. It means that families sent their sons off to war trusting the military would look after them when the military had already calculated acceptable casualty rates. It means that the heroism and courage of D-Day was built partly on necessary lies. So here's what I want you to take away from this. D-Day was absolutely heroic. Those soldiers who stormed those beaches showed incredible courage and changed the course of history. Their sacrifice was real and should never be diminished. But we should also be honest about the leadership decisions that put them in that situation. Eisenhower was a great general who made the hard choices necessary for victory, but those choices involved moral compromises that we should remember and think about. The men who fought on D-Day deserved better intelligence, better planning, better support, but they got what the fog of war and the limitations of 1944 could provide. And despite all the failures, all the hidden truths, all the terrible casualties, they still won. That's the real miracle of D-Day. Not that everything went according to plan, because it didn't, but that Allied soldiers had the courage and determination to succeed anyway. If this video changed how you see D-Day, drop a comment and let me know what surprised you most. Share this with someone who's interested in real World War II history, not the sanitized version, but the complicated truth. And make sure you're subscribed to WW2 Echoes, because we're going to keep digging into these hidden stories, the ones that reveal the full human cost of war and the impossible choices that leaders had to make. History isn't clean or simple. It's messy and tragic and sometimes morally gray. But that's exactly why we need to study it, understand it, and learn from it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video, where we uncover more truths about World War II that nobody wants to talk about.